The woman's name has not survived in any record that anyone has thought to preserve, and the date was sometime in the autumn of 1936, and what she was doing was the same thing she did twice a week in the same store on the same 2 days, which was walking the aisles of the Standard Food Store on North Robinson Avenue in Oklahoma City with a wire shopping basket hanging from the crook of her right arm. The basket was the kind every grocery store in America provided to its customers in that era. A shallow wire frame with a handle, about the size of a large kitchen pot, capable of holding perhaps 6 or 8 cans of food before the weight of it made the arm that carried it begin to ache. She had been walking for perhaps 20 minutes, and her basket was already full enough that she had shifted it from her right arm to her left arm twice, and a man standing near the front of the store, near the door, had been watching her do this. His name was Sylvan Goldman. He owned the store, and the thing he was watching, a woman switching a heavy basket from one arm to the other because both arms were getting tired, was the thing that he could not stop thinking about for the next 4 months. Sylvan Goldman was 40 years old in 1936 and had been in the grocery business his entire adult life. He had grown up in Ardmore, in what was still officially designated Indian Territory when he was born, and had come to the grocery trade through his family, who operated wholesale food ventures in the years after the First World War. By the mid-1930s, he and his brother Alfred had built a modest chain of grocery stores in Oklahoma City under 2 banners, the Standard Food Stores and the Humpty Dumpty Stores. And Sylvan had spent enough years watching customers move through his stores to have accumulated a detailed knowledge of the specific ways that grocery shopping created difficulty for the people doing it. He knew which aisles moved slowly and which moved fast. He knew which displays customers stopped at and which they walked past. And he knew that the wire shopping basket every store gave its customers was, for a shopping trip of any significant length, a genuinely uncomfortable object to carry, because he had watched thousands of people carry it and had seen what it did to their arms and their posture and their willingness to stay in the store and keep buying. The wire shopping basket was not new in 1936. It had been a fixture of American grocery stores for decades, long enough that neither the stores nor the customers who used them thought of it as a design problem any more than they thought of the shelves as a design problem or the floor as a design problem. It was simply the object you took from the stack near the door when you entered and returned to the stack when you left. And the weight of what you put in it was, in the implicit understanding of the era, your problem rather than the store's problem. The store's job was to stock the shelves. Your job was to carry what you selected from them. If you could not carry much because your arms were limited in what they could hold, or because you were older than carrying heavy things comfortably allowed, you bought less, and the store sold less, and the arrangement was accepted as the natural limitation of the form, rather than as a problem that the form itself had created, and that the form itself could be changed to solve. Sylvan Goldman understood it as the latter. That was the difference between him and the other grocery men in Oklahoma City, and it is the difference that explains why the shopping cart exists at all. What Goldman understood, standing near the door of his store, watching the woman with the wire basket, was something that was not an insight so much as an arithmetic. If a customer's arms could hold 8 pounds of groceries before fatigue and discomfort began to influence her choices, then his store would sell 8 pounds of groceries to that customer on that visit. If a customer could somehow bring 40 pounds of groceries through the store without her arms ever being asked to hold the weight, the limit on what she bought would be something other than the physical capacity of her body. It would be her appetite, her budget, her needs for the week, her sense of what her family required. These were limits too, but they were larger limits than the ones her arms imposed, and the difference between what those larger limits allowed and what her arms allowed was the difference between what Goldman's store was selling and what it could sell. He went home that evening and sat in his kitchen with a folding chair and a pair of wire baskets and began working on what would become, in the course of 4 months of evening hours in that kitchen, the object that nobody on earth wanted. The prototype that Goldman built in his kitchen in the winter of 1936 was a folding chair with 2 wire baskets attached to a frame of metal tubing that could be wheeled through a store. The baskets were mounted one above the other on the frame, which sat on 4 wheels, and the wheels were the same kind of caster wheels used on industrial dollies and hospital equipment. The frame itself folded when not in use, which was a feature Goldman believed was essential to any grocery store operator who would have to store dozens of these things in a space that was not designed to accommodate them. The folding mechanism worked the same way a folding chair works, with a hinge at the side that allowed the frame to collapse flat, and Goldman tested it in his kitchen by folding and unfolding it until he was satisfied that a store employee could operate it without instruction and without difficulty. The whole thing, folded, was about the size of a large suitcase. Unfolded, it was approximately the size of a piece of furniture, which was larger than any object a grocery customer had previously been expected to push through a grocery store, and Goldman was aware that this was going to be a problem. Goldman took his prototype to a man named Fred Young, a carpenter who did commercial work in Oklahoma City, and asked Young to build a version of it that could be manufactured in quantity. Young built several, and Goldman had them installed in his standard stores in June of 1937, placed near the entrance in a stack, with a sign explaining that customers were welcome to use them free of charge. He watched the entrance on the first morning they were available with the specific attention of a man who has spent 4 months building something and is now about to find out what the world thinks of it. What the world thought of it, as represented by the customers of the Standard Food Store on North Robinson Avenue on a June morning in 1937, was that they did not want it. Men walked past the stack of carts without stopping. Women walked past the stack of carts without stopping. Older customers, who Goldman had assumed would be the most enthusiastic adopters because their arms were the most limited, walked past the stack of carts without stopping. By the end of the first morning, not a single customer had taken a cart. By the end of the first week, the number was still effectively 0. The carts sat near the entrance, folded in their stack, and the customers of the Standard Food Store continued to carry their wire baskets exactly as they had always done. Goldman talked to customers that first week and the weeks that followed and collected the reasons they gave for not using the carts, and the reasons were consistent enough to constitute a pattern. Women told him that they had spent their lives carrying things and did not need a cart to carry their groceries. Men told him that a cart was something for women and children, and that they were perfectly capable of carrying their own purchases. Older customers told him that the cart made them feel old, as if they could not manage without assistance, and they could manage, and they would like to manage, thank you. The specific objections differed in their surface details, but all of them pointed to the same underlying thing, which was that using the cart felt like an admission of inadequacy. It felt like announcing to the other customers in the store that your arms were not strong enough, or that you were not capable of managing your own shopping like an adult. The cart, in the perception of the people Goldman was trying to give it to, was not a convenience, it was an insult. Goldman understood the problem within 2 weeks of opening, and his solution to it is the part of the shopping cart story that almost nobody knows, which is that he hired people. He hired a man and a woman and gave them each a cart and stationed them at the entrance of the Standard Store on North Robinson Avenue on a Saturday morning, Saturday being the busiest shopping day of the week, and paid them to push carts through the store as if they were shopping. They were not shopping, they were performing shopping, in the specific theatrical sense that their purpose was to be seen doing it by real customers who were making up their minds about whether to take a cart from the stack. The professional shoppers pushed their carts, the greeter offered carts to the arriving customers watched the professional shoppers and watched the other customers who had accepted carts from the greeter, and by the middle of that Saturday morning, something that had not happened in the preceding weeks began to happen. Real customers began taking carts. Not many, a few, but a few was not 0, and 0 was what Goldman had had before. And from the first real customer who pushed a cart through the Standard Store's aisles in the summer of 1937, the direction of the thing was established.
even if the speed of it was not. The customers who used the carts in those first weeks in 1937 spent more money than the customers who did not. Goldman knew this because he tracked it, and the tracking was not complicated. He could compare the receipts of cart-using customers against the receipts of basket-carrying customers and see the difference in the average transaction, and the difference was real and consistent and large enough to matter. The customers with carts were not buying different things. They were buying more of the same things. They were taking the second can of tomatoes because the first can was already in the cart, and the cart was bearing the weight, not their arms. They were adding the bag of flour that they usually left because there was no way to carry it along with everything else. They were moving through the store more slowly, pausing at displays they usually walked past because the cart removed the urgency that a heavy basket creates in its carrier, the urgency to finish and put the thing down. A customer with a heavy basket in her hand is a customer who wants to get to the checkout. A customer with a cart is a customer who has time to look at what is on the shelf in front of her, and what is on the shelf in front of her is what Goldman was trying to sell. Goldman filed his patent for the folding basket carrier on July 9, 1937, 2 weeks after installing the first carts in his standard stores. The patent was granted on October 4, 1938, patent number 2,196,914, and it described the folding frame, the two-basket arrangement, and the caster wheels with a specificity that was intended to prevent the exact thing that was already beginning to happen, which was that other grocery operators, seeing what Goldman had built and what it was doing for his stores, were beginning to build versions of their own without asking Goldman's permission or paying Goldman anything. Goldman had spent approximately $7,000 developing the cart and the manufacturing process that produced it, which was not a trivial sum for a regional grocery operator in Oklahoma City in 1937, and he had not spent it so that the grocery industry at large could adopt his invention without compensating him for it. The patent gave Goldman the legal basis to charge for the use of his design, which he did, establishing a licensing program through which grocery stores across the country could pay for the right to use the folding basket carrier. The licensing fees were modest enough that the largest grocery chains could absorb them without significant difficulty, and the benefit to the stores was substantial enough that the fee could be justified even by operators who resented paying it. Goldman hired a sales force to travel the country and demonstrate the cart to grocery store operators, and the sales force had the same initial skepticism from the operators that Goldman had encountered from his customers in 1937, which was that the cart was too large, too strange, too different from the wire basket that had always been sufficient for the purpose. The sales force had the same answer to this skepticism that Goldman had had for his customers, which was to demonstrate the thing in use and let the evidence make the argument. The evidence was the transaction data. In every store where carts had been installed, average transaction size had increased. The number was not subtle. It was not a rounding error. It was a real number, and real numbers are persuasive to people who are in the business of generating them. The resistance from the industry lasted through the late 1930s and dissolved in the early 1940s for reasons that had nothing to do with Goldman's patent or his sales force. The Second World War changed the American grocery industry in ways that made the shopping cart not merely convenient, but close to necessary, because the war removed from the American workforce a substantial portion of the men who had previously worked as store clerks, and store clerks were the people who had carried goods from the stockroom to the shelf, and from the shelf to the customer's car, and from one part of the store to another. Stores that had operated with 8 clerks were operating with 3. The cart, which moved goods through the store without a clerk's assistance, was not simply a customer convenience in this environment, it was an operational necessity. Stores adopted it during the war years not because Goldman's sales force had finally persuaded their management, but because the alternative was a store that could not function with the staff it had.
The war years transformed the American grocery store in ways that outlasted the war itself, and the shopping cart was one of the instruments of that transformation. The stores that adopted carts during the war because they had no choice kept them after the war because their customers had learned to use them, and customers who had learned to use them had also learned to shop differently than they had shopped before the cart existed. A customer with a cart moved through the store in a different pattern than a customer with a basket. She moved more slowly. She covered more of the floor. She spent more time in the aisles and less time near the checkout. She bought more, consistently and measurably, and the stores that had the data from the wartime cart adoption could see the before and after comparison with a clarity that eliminated any remaining doubt about what the cart was doing to their revenue. The post-war American grocery industry did not need Goldman's sales force to explain the shopping cart to it any longer. It had explained it to itself. Goldman was, in the meantime, licensing his patent to as many of the stores adopting carts as he could reach, and the licensing revenue was generating income that bore little relationship to the modest sums he had invested in developing the cart. The $7,000 he had spent in 1936 and 1937 was being returned to him many times over, and the rate of return was increasing as the grocery industry's adoption of the cart accelerated through the early 1940s. Goldman had not anticipated the war's role in his invention's adoption, but he was organized to benefit from it, and he benefited substantially. He was also aware, as any inventor whose product is being adopted at speed must be, that the rate of adoption brings with it a rate of variation, that stores and manufacturers trying to build their own carts without paying his licensing fee were modifying the design in ways just different enough from his patent to challenge its coverage, and that the protection the patent provided was not unlimited in time or in scope. The variations in cart design that emerged through the early 1940s were driven by two pressures operating in opposite directions. Stores wanted carts that were larger because larger carts could carry more groceries, and carrying more groceries was what the sales data said the cart was for. Manufacturers working outside Goldman's license wanted carts that were different enough from his patent to be legally defensible, which meant finding configurations of the frame, the basket, and the wheels that solved the same problem Goldman's design solved without replicating the specific features he had patented. The result was a period of experimentation in shopping cart design that produced a range of objects sharing the fundamental principle, wheeled frame, basket, customer-operated, while differing in the specific expression of that principle in ways that reflected both the commercial pressures of the moment and the engineering preferences of whoever was doing the building. The cart that won this competition, the form that persisted beyond the experimental period and became the standard that all subsequent shopping carts would be measured against, was not Goldman's original folding design. It was a design developed by an inventor named Earl Watson, a Kansas City man who had been thinking about shopping carts since the late 1930s and who in 1946 filed a patent for a cart that could nest with other carts of the same design when stored, one cart sliding inside the next in a telescoping arrangement that allowed 100 carts to occupy the space that Goldman's original folding design would have required 40 carts to fill. The nesting cart was a solution to a problem that Goldman's cart had created, which was that grocery stores filling with carts needed somewhere to put them when they were not in use, and the space required for that storage was competing with the space required for selling groceries.
Earl Watson had been working on the problem of shopping cart storage since he had seen Goldman's cart demonstrated at a grocery industry trade show, and had noted, with the specific attention of a man who was thinking about the same problem from a different angle, that the folding mechanism Goldman had built into his cart was clever, but that it did not solve the storage problem so much as compress it. A folded cart occupied roughly half the space of an unfolded cart, but half the space was still space, and a grocery store with 200 carts needed to store 200 of them somewhere every night.
Watson's insight was that the storage problem was not a matter of making each individual cart smaller, but of making the carts fit inside each other, the way paper cups fit inside each other, or the way dining chairs can be stacked in a way that folding chairs cannot. If the front of one cart could slide inside the rear of another cart when they were aligned, the stack of carts would take up approximately the space of one cart plus a small increment for each additional cart nested within it, and 100 carts could be stored in the space of perhaps 6 or 7 individual carts standing alone. Watson's nesting patent was filed in 1946 and granted in 1948, and it described the specific geometry of the cart's frame that allowed the nesting to work, which was a front section that was narrower than the rear section by precisely enough to allow the front of one cart to pass inside the rear of the next. The mechanism required that the basket be hinged at the rear so that it could pivot upward when a cart was pushed into the back of the cart ahead of it, and the pivoting basket became the defining visual feature of the Watson cart and of every shopping cart built to its specification thereafter, which is to say, every shopping cart that has been built in any country at any time since the early 1950s. If you have pushed a shopping cart in the last 70 years, the basket you loaded your groceries into was a hinged basket that swung up when someone pushed another cart into the back of yours, and that basket was Orla Watson's, and Watson was working in response to Sylvan Goldman, and both of them were working in response to a woman on North Robinson Avenue who was switching a wire basket from one tired arm to the other on an autumn afternoon in 1936. Goldman's reaction to Watson's nesting cart was not passive. He sued. He argued that Watson's design infringed his patent, and the litigation between the two men moved through the court system through the late 1940s and into the early 1950s. The courts ultimately determined that Watson's nesting mechanism was sufficiently different from Goldman's folding mechanism to constitute an independent invention, which meant that Watson's patent was valid and Goldman's claim against it was not. Goldman accepted the outcome and turned his attention to licensing Watson's design, which had by then become the standard, rather than continuing to promote his own folding design against a market that had decided the nesting cart was superior. The pragmatism of this response is characteristic of Goldman's approach to the shopping cart throughout its history. He was not a man who was attached to the specific form of his invention. He was attached to what the invention did, which was move more groceries through a store per customer per visit. And if Watson's cart did that better than his own, then Watson's cart was what the stores should have. The licensing revenue Goldman received from the shopping cart through the late 1940s and into the 1950s was by that point the foundation of a business empire that had little to do with groceries. Goldman had sold his grocery stores in 1944 during the peak of the wartime cart adoption, at a moment when the stores were generating strong revenue and at a price that reflected that strength. The money from the sale, combined with the cart licensing income, gave Goldman the capital to invest in real estate and other ventures that would eventually make him one of the wealthier men in Oklahoma, not because he had sold groceries, but because he had watched a woman switch a wire basket from one arm to the other and had spent 4 months in his kitchen trying to understand what she was telling him by doing it. The cart had been the beginning of something larger than the cart, which is not unusual in the history of inventions, but is worth noting in the case of the shopping cart because the cart itself is so ordinary, so entirely integrated into the routine of modern life, that it requires a deliberate effort to remember that it was once something no one wanted. The post-war American grocery store was a different institution from the grocery store that Sylvan Goldman had watched his customers navigate with wire baskets in 1936, and the shopping cart was a significant cause of the difference, though not the only one. The stores that opened in the late 1940s and throughout the 1950s were larger than their pre-war predecessors, and they were larger in part because the cart made it possible to build them larger. A grocery store whose customers carry their purchases in a basket is a grocery store constrained by the physical limits of what a human arm can hold, because no customer will walk to the far end of a very long store to get a can of soup if the walk back with a full basket will be punishing. A grocery store whose customers push their purchases in a cart is a grocery store that can be as long as the real estate allows and as wide as the budget permits, because the distance the cart travels is not a burden to the customer in the way that the distance a basket travels is a burden to the arm. The supermarket as an architectural form was enabled by the shopping cart, in the same way that the suburb was enabled by the automobile. The cart did not cause the supermarket in any simple causal sense, but the supermarket as it actually existed, with its 40,000 square feet of floor space and its 18,000 individual products, could not have existed without the cart that made it navigating it practical. The parking lot that surrounded the post-war supermarket was itself a consequence of the shopping cart, or rather a consequence of the same change in shopping behavior that the cart had produced. A customer who bought more groceries per trip because a cart allowed her to buy more groceries per trip was a customer who could not carry what she had bought to public transportation and take it home that way. The groceries filled the cart, and the cart had to be unloaded into a car, and the car had to be parked somewhere, and the somewhere was the parking lot that grew around the supermarket in the post-war years until the parking lot was frequently larger than the store itself. The relationship between the shopping cart and the automobile is not usually described as a causal one, but the volume of groceries that a cart made it comfortable to buy in a single trip was a volume that essentially required a car to transport home. And the stores understood this and built for it, and the parking lot became the visible expression of the cart's effect on how much Americans bought when they went grocery shopping. The woman who loaded her groceries into a station wagon in a supermarket parking lot in 1955 was doing something that would have been logistically impossible for the woman on North Robinson Avenue in 1936, not because the 1936 woman was less capable, but because the 1936 woman did not have a cart, and without a cart she could not have assembled in a single shopping trip the volume of goods that the station wagon was necessary to carry home. The cart had not only changed how much people bought, it had changed when they bought it, because a customer who could buy a week's worth of groceries in a single trip could shop once a week instead of twice, and a customer who shopped once a week had a different relationship to the grocery store than one who came in 3 times a week. The store became a destination rather than a daily necessity. The trip became an event rather than an errand. The station wagon and the supermarket parking lot and the weekly big shop that is still the organizing structure of food purchasing for most American, British, Canadian, and Australian families today, all of it flows from Goldman's cart and Watson's nesting mechanism and the summer of 1937 when nobody wanted either of them. What the shopping cart did to the grocery industry's economics was measurable in the way that things measured in dollars are always measurable, but what it did to American domestic life was something that took longer to account for and was never fully accounted for because it was so thoroughly absorbed into the routine of that life. The weekly grocery shopping trip became a social institution in the post-war years, organized around the car and the cart and the supermarket and the parking lot and the list that the housewife made on Thursday or Friday for the Saturday trip. Children came along and rode in the seat at the front of the cart, which was a feature added to the cart's design in the early 1950s specifically to solve the problem of what to do with a small child in a store whose aisles were now full of carts that were dangerous to a child walking among them. The child in the cart seat is so familiar an image of 20th century American domestic life that it is difficult to see it as the solution to an engineering problem. But it was, and the problem it solved had been created by the cart itself, which is a pattern that technological adoption produces with enough frequency to count as a rule.
The child seat at the front of the shopping cart was introduced not by Goldman and not by Watson, but by a variety of manufacturers responding to the specific problem that small children presented in large stores full of wheeled carts. A child who could walk was a child who could be hit by a cart being pushed by a customer who did not see the child, and the stores that had adopted carts in the late 1940s were beginning to receive complaints about near misses and actual collisions with increasing frequency. The solution was obvious once someone thought of it, which is always how obvious solutions present themselves, not as obvious at the time, but as inevitable afterward. A frame within the cart at the front, sized for a small child, with a bar across the front to prevent the child from falling forward. The first versions of it appeared in the early 1950s, and within a decade it was a standard feature on every cart built for the American market, and the image of a small child sitting in a shopping cart with its legs dangling through the frame became one of the representative images of American family life in the second half of the 20th century. The cart had by the mid-1950s moved so thoroughly into the ordinary experience of grocery shopping that it had become invisible in the specific way that essential things become invisible, which is that people stopped noticing it and started simply using it. A person who has pushed a shopping cart through a store twice a week for 10 years does not think of the cart as an invention. They think of the cart as a cart, the same way they think of the door as a door and the shelf as a shelf, as a component of an environment that exists for purposes they understand and that they move through without needing to think about how it came to be the way it is. This invisibility is the measure of the cart's success. An object that people notice is an object that still has rough edges, still has aspects that do not quite fit the purpose for which it is being used. An object that people stop noticing has fitted itself so completely to the purpose that the purpose and the object have become the same thing, and the history of how they came to be the same thing is something that can only be recovered by deliberate effort. Goldman watched the cart become invisible with the satisfaction of a man who had predicted this would happen, and whose prediction had taken longer to verify than he had expected. He was in his early 50s by the mid-1950s, no longer in the grocery business, comfortable with the licensing revenue that was still arriving from the stores that were still building and buying carts to his original specifications. He was also aware, in the way that inventors of successful things sometimes become aware, that the object he had built in his kitchen in the winter of 1936 was now a global object, that grocery stores in England and Canada and Australia were filling with carts that were direct descendants of the wire and tubing prototype he had tested on that Saturday morning in 1937, with hired actors performing the role of willing customers. He had not planned for the world. He had planned for North Robinson Avenue. The world had arrived on its own, as the world tends to do when a problem is universal enough and a solution is clear enough, and the evidence of the solution's value is available to anyone willing to look at the numbers. The international spread of the shopping cart followed the international spread of the supermarket format itself, which followed the post-war expansion of American commercial culture into the economies of the other English-speaking nations and beyond. British grocery retailers had been watching the American supermarket model through the late 1940s and had begun adopting it in the early 1950s, and the cart came with the model the way the parking lot came with the model, as a component that the format required rather than a feature that could be selected independently. The Sainsbury's and the Marks and Spencer food halls that began appearing in British high streets and eventually on British retail parks in the 1950s and 1960s filled with the same nesting carts that were filling the Safeways and A&P stores in California and Ohio, and the British housewife who pushed a cart through a Sainsbury's on a Saturday morning in 1958 was performing in her context and her currency and her vocabulary exactly the action that the woman on North Robinson Avenue had refused to perform in the summer of 1937.
The resistance that had characterized the American public's first encounter with the shopping cart in 1937 did not repeat itself in Britain or Canada or Australia with quite the same intensity, in part because those populations were encountering the cart at a moment when it was already established in its country of origin, and a thing that is established somewhere tends to arrive in a new place with the legitimacy of prior existence rather than the strangeness of novelty. British shoppers in 1958 were not being asked to accept a strange new object that an Oklahoma City grocery man had invented. They were being given access to something that Americans already had, and the aspiration to the American standard of post-war domestic life that was a significant feature of British popular culture in the 1950s meant that the shopping cart arrived in British stores with a cultural endorsement that Goldman had not been able to provide for it in American stores in 1937. The cart was American. American things in 1958 were modern. Modern things were desirable. The resistance dissolved before it could fully form. The cart's adoption outside the United States also reflected the degree to which the object had been refined by the time it traveled. The cart that arrived in British stores in the late 1950s was not Goldman's folding design or Watson's first nesting design, but a generation or two of improvement beyond both, built by manufacturers who had absorbed the lessons of a decade of American grocery store operation and had modified the design accordingly. The casters were better, the baskets were larger and deeper, the child seat was already integrated, the nesting mechanism operated more smoothly and stored more compactly. The cart that the British housewife pushed through Sainsbury's in 1958 was a more capable object than the cart that Goldman's hired actor had pushed through the Standard store in 1937, and the woman in Sainsbury's, unlike the woman on North Robinson Avenue, had no memory of a world without it to measure it against. For her, the cart was simply what you used when you went grocery shopping, which is the most complete form of adoption an invention can achieve. The decade between 1950 and 1960 was the decade in which the shopping cart finished becoming what it still is, in the sense that the fundamental design parameters were established in that decade and have not changed in any essential way since. The nesting mechanism Watson had patented in 1948 became universal. The child seat became standard. The basket size settled into a range that reflected the volume of a typical American or British weekly shop as that shop existed in the post-war prosperity of the 1950s. The casters settled on a four-wheel configuration with swiveling front wheels that allowed the cart to be steered and pushed simultaneously, which sounds obvious but had been a source of experimentation through the early adoption period when various numbers of wheels and various wheel configurations had been tried and found wanting. By 1960, the shopping cart looked in all its essential features like the shopping cart you will find in any supermarket in any English-speaking country today. The subsequent 60 years have produced refinements in materials and manufacturing, but the object those refinements have been applied to is the object that Orla Watson designed and Goldman adopted in the late 1940s, built in response to the cart that Goldman had assembled in his kitchen and the woman he had watched on North Robinson Avenue. By 1960, Goldman's licensing income from the cart had made him wealthy enough that the grocery business he had sold in 1944 was a relatively small chapter in his financial history. The patent itself had expired by then, which meant that any manufacturer could build and sell shopping carts without paying Goldman anything, and the manufacturers were doing exactly that, producing carts in the hundreds of thousands and selling them to the supermarket chains that were opening new stores at a rate of several hundred a year across the country. Goldman did not resent the expiration. He had earned from it what was reasonable to earn from it, and the industry that had adopted the cart was by 1960 an industry so thoroughly organized around it that the cart's inventor was to that industry a historical footnote rather than an active commercial presence. The footnote was accurate, and the money was real, and Goldman was satisfied with both, which is a form of satisfaction that inventors do not always achieve, and which Goldman had earned by doing something that took more courage than the wire basket and the folding chair might suggest, which was to believe that a problem everyone had accepted as a condition of grocery shopping was actually a problem that a kitchen and 4 months and a hired actor on a Saturday morning could solve.
Goldman spent the 1960s and 1970s as a wealthy man in Oklahoma City, known in that community more for his philanthropy and his real estate holdings than for the shopping cart, which was by then too ordinary an object for most people to connect to any individual inventor. He had established a foundation that funded medical and educational institutions in Oklahoma, and the foundation's activities were the public face of his wealth in a way that the shopping cart never was. partly because he did not promote the cart's connection to himself, and partly because the journalists and editors who covered Oklahoma City's wealthy residents in the 1960s and 1970s found a foundation that funded hospitals more interesting than a man who had invented something that everyone used without thinking about it. The invisibility that was the measure of the cart's success was also, in Goldman's public life, the measure of his anonymity as its inventor. He had made something so ordinary that the ordinariness had swallowed the making. The cart was not completely forgotten as an invention in Goldman's lifetime. Several profiles appeared in business publications through the 1970s and early 1980s that told the story of the cart's origin and credited Goldman with it, and Goldman was cooperative with the journalists who sought him out, patient in explaining the wire basket and the folding chair and the hired actors and the woman who would not take a cart because she did not need anyone's help carrying her groceries. He told the story without apparent bitterness about the Watson patent dispute or the manufacturers who had built carts without licensing his design, and without apparent pride in the magnitude of what the cart had become, which was one of the most manufactured and most used objects in the modern commercial world. He told it the way a man tells a story about something he did a long time ago that turned out to matter more than he expected, which is the tone of a man who has had time to understand the proportions of what he accomplished without needing to inflate them. Watson, who had patented the nesting mechanism that made the modern shopping cart possible, lived a quieter life than Goldman and attracted less attention from the journalists who occasionally reconstructed the cart's history. He had been a craftsman and inventor rather than a businessman, and the patent licensing revenue from his nesting design had not generated the kind of wealth that Goldman's broader commercial activities had produced. Watson died in 1981 in Kansas City, having spent his later years in modest circumstances, known primarily to his family and neighbors rather than to the grocery industry or the public. His name does not appear in most histories of the shopping cart, which tend to begin and end with Goldman, partly because Goldman's story is more dramatic, the man who hired actors to demonstrate his own invention to customers who refused to use it, has a better narrative shape than the man who solved the storage problem, and partly because Watson's contribution, the nesting mechanism, is so thoroughly absorbed into the object that most people cannot imagine the cart without it, which means that most people cannot see Watson's contribution as a contribution at all. For any American in 1984, and a very large fortune for an Oklahoma City man who had made most of it from a wire basket on wheels. The obituary in the New York Times was brief and accurate. It identified him as the inventor of the shopping cart and noted his philanthropic activities and described the cart's origin in the Standard Food Store on North Robinson Avenue in Oklahoma City in 1937. The obituary did not attempt to calculate how many shopping carts were in use in the world at the moment of Goldman's death, and the number would have been difficult to calculate precisely, but the American grocery industry alone was operating in the early 1980s with approximately 30 million carts in use across the country's supermarkets and grocery stores, and the international number was several times that. Every one of those carts was a descendant of the folding basket carrier that Goldman had built in his kitchen from a folding chair and a piece of wire, and had placed near the entrance of his store, and had watched every customer in the store walk past without touching.
The shopping cart that waits for you near the entrance of a supermarket today is made of steel wire or plastic or a combination of both, depending on the manufacturer and the purchasing preference of the chain that operates the store. It has 4 wheels, with the 2 rear wheels fixed and the 2 front wheels swiveling, and this wheel configuration has been unchanged in its essentials since it was settled upon in the early 1950s. The basket hinges at the rear, swinging up when another cart is pushed into it from behind, and the hinge that allows this is Orla Watson's hinge, built to his 1948 patent specification in spirit, if not in material, in every cart built for any store in any English-speaking country for the past 70 years. The child seat at the front, with the bar that folds down across the child's lap, was a feature added to the design in the early 1950s to solve the problem that small children in large stores presented, and it has been a standard feature of the cart ever since, its engineering so reliable that nobody modifies it and nobody needs to. The handle at the rear of the cart is at a height that was standardized through the 1950s to accommodate the average height of an American adult pushing the cart from behind, and it has remained at approximately that height despite the fact that the average height of American adults has increased by slightly more than an inch in the intervening decades. This is typical of standardized objects whose dimensions were established before the standard was questioned, which is to say, before the standard had been in place long enough to develop the inertia that makes standards resistant to change, even when the conditions that produced them have shifted. The cart is the right height for the person who standardized it in 1955, and the person pushing it today who finds it slightly low is pushing a cart designed for a person slightly shorter than themselves, and they adjust their posture accordingly without knowing why they are adjusting it, because the cart is so familiar and so ordinary that its dimensions feel like natural facts rather than historical decisions. The number of shopping carts in use in the world today is not precisely known because no organization tracks it comprehensively, but estimates from the shopping cart manufacturing industry, which is a small and specialized industrial sector that operates in the shadow of the much larger grocery industry it supplies, suggests that somewhere between 3 and 400 million shopping carts are in use globally. The United States alone has approximately 35 million carts, and the number has held roughly steady for several decades because the number of grocery stores in the country has held roughly steady, and each store operates with a cart inventory that is approximately proportional to its size. The carts last somewhere between 5 and 15 years in active service, depending on how hard the store's traffic is and how much damage they accumulate from the specific hazards of grocery store operation, which include being pushed into things by customers who are not paying attention to where they are going and being left in parking lots where they roll into cars at speeds that are low enough not to cause injury and high enough to dent doors. The shopping cart corral, the designated area in a supermarket parking lot where customers are expected to return their carts after loading their groceries into their vehicles, is a problem that Goldman did not anticipate and Watson did not solve, and that the grocery industry spent several decades addressing with varying degrees of success. Goldman's cart was designed for use inside the store. The problem of what happened to it after the customer left the store with their groceries was a problem that arose from the adoption of the car and the supermarket parking lot and the weekly shop that the cart had helped create. And it was a problem that supermarkets addressed first by hiring people to retrieve the carts from the parking lot, and later by designing areas within the parking lot where customers could leave them without walking all the way back to the store entrance. The quarter in the slot mechanism that some European stores adopted, requiring customers to insert a coin to unlock a cart and returning the coin when the cart was returned, solved the retrieval problem with a financial incentive that the American grocery industry never embraced at scale, because the American grocery industry decided that the inconvenience of the coin mechanism cost more in customer goodwill than the cart retrieval problem cost in labor.
The plastic shopping cart, which began appearing in American stores in the 1970s and has gradually replaced steel wire carts in many environments since then, is the most significant design change the shopping cart has undergone since the nesting mechanism was standardized in the early 1950s. Plastic carts are lighter than steel carts, which makes them easier to push and easier to nest in large quantities. They are also quieter, which matters in stores where the noise of steel carts on hard floors has accumulated over the decades into one of the defining auditory experiences of grocery shopping. The specific metallic rattle of a steel cart on a stone or tile floor, a sound that announces grocery shopping the way the bell announces a church service and the whistle announces a train. The plastic cart does not rattle. It moves in relative silence through the store's aisles, and some chains have embraced the silence, and some have found it slightly wrong, slightly less like a grocery store than the version they grew up in, and the preference for steel carts in certain stores is in some cases a preference for the sound as much as for the object. The cart that is most familiar to the generation of shoppers who grew up in American, British, Canadian, and Australian supermarkets in the 1960s and 1970s is the steel wire cart with the plastic handle at the back and the hinged basket and the child seat with the 2 leg holes in the front. And the familiarity of that cart is not simply visual familiarity, but the full sensory familiarity of an object encountered hundreds of times in childhood, its weight and its sound, and the specific wobble of a cart whose front wheels are slightly misaligned, a wobble that every grocery shopper knows and manages without thinking by adjusting the direction of their push. The cart of that generation's childhood is not more functional than the cart of today. It is simply more familiar, which is not the same thing, but feels, in the specific register of childhood memory, like it might be. Sylvan Goldman did not push shopping carts in his later years. He was a wealthy man in a city where wealthy men were not expected to do their own grocery shopping, and the cart that bore his invention moved through the stores of Oklahoma City and through the stores of every other city in the English-speaking world without him in any of them. He had watched the invention leave his kitchen and leave his patent filing and leave his licensing agreements and leave any connection to him that most of the people using it would ever be aware of, and it had become the thing that all successful inventions become, which is a thing so thoroughly integrated into the practice it was designed to serve that the practice can no longer be imagined without it. You cannot imagine grocery shopping without a cart the way you cannot imagine a road without a lane marking or a library without a shelving system. These things feel like the necessary structure of their activities rather than the invented solutions to problems that the activities once had. That feeling is the measure of how completely the problem was solved. The woman who reaches for a cart at the entrance of a supermarket today does not think about Sylvan Goldman or Orla Watson or North Robinson Avenue in Oklahoma City or the summer of 1937. She does not think about the woman whose tired arms gave Goldman the problem he spent 4 months solving. She does not think about the hired actors who pushed carts through the aisles of a grocery store in Oklahoma City on a Saturday morning to show the real customers what the carts looked like in use. She does not think about Watson's nesting mechanism or Goldman's patent dispute or the wartime clerk shortage that forced the grocery industry to adopt the cart faster than Goldman's sales force could have managed on its own. She reaches for the cart because the cart is there, and the cart is what you use, and the cart is what has always been there for as long as she can remember, which in most cases means for as long as she has been old enough to go grocery shopping with her mother. Her mother used a cart. Her grandmother used a cart. The cart has always been there, and the woman reaching for it today has no reason to know that it was not always there, that there was a specific morning in a specific store in Oklahoma City when it was not there, when it was in a kitchen in Goldman's house being folded and unfolded by a man who could not stop thinking about a woman's tired arm. Goldman died having spent $200 million less than he had made, and having made $200 million from an idea that nobody wanted on the morning he introduced it. The cart he built is still there. It is waiting at the entrance of every supermarket in the country you are sitting in as you watch this, and it is waiting in the way that all ordinary things wait, which is without history and without announcement, simply present and available and ready to be taken.